Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Very pleased to meet you all, and thank you for being here. I'm sorry I don't speak Italian, but we have some excellent interpreters, so let's hope for the best. This is going to be quite a long talk. It might be, I don't know, 2 hours, 2.5 hours, and then we'll have question and answer. I hope it's not too long. All right, so this is can we get these lights off behind the screen, Seb, as we arranged beforehand? We've all heard myths. There are myths from every part of the world that speak of a former golden age, of some kind of time in the remote prehistory of mankind when we were very advanced at harmony and peace, living prosperously on earth, and then there was some cataclysm and it came to an end. And the question I'm asking is, in the night of time, in the depths of the last ice age, thousands of years before the first civilizations supposedly arose, could we have lost track of an earlier advanced civilization? Could there actually be some reality to those myths of a former golden age? Now, our kind of human being, anatomically modern human beings, have existed on Earth for at least 300,000 years. Probably longer, but at least 300,000 years. And yet, if we listen to mainstream archaeology, there was no such thing as civilization until 5,000 years ago. So the question is, what were we doing for those 295,000 years? We had the brains, we had the anatomically modern form, but we appear not to have created civilization until 5,000 years ago. Or is it possible that we did create an earlier civilization? And that through changes in the earth, we have forgotten about it. This is what I call the house of history. It's the way we're taught about history and prehistory in school. We start with the Stone Age, which archaeologists refer to as the Paleolithic. And the Stone Age is divided into 2 stages, the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic. Sometimes the Mesolithic these days is referred to as the Upper Paleolithic. And then after that we have the Neolithic, about 11,000 years ago, and then we go on into the early development of agriculture, and then the first civilizations about 6,000 or 5,000 years ago. And it seems to be a very well worked out timeline, and there doesn't seem to be any room in it for a lost civilization. But new evidence has come to light, which archaeology has not yet taken account of. And this new evidence concerns a global cataclysm referred to as the Younger Dryas cataclysm that occurred between 12,800 years ago and 11,600 years ago. And it's right there in the foundations of the house of history. And if archaeologists do not take account of it, then it's possible that they've given us a completely misleading story of human civilization, an extinction-level global cataclysm. I think everybody is familiar with the story of the dinosaurs. We all know that the dinosaurs were made extinct by a cosmic impact, either an asteroid or a comet, which hit the Earth 65 million years ago. In fact, the most recent information is that it was almost certainly a comet rather than an asteroid. One of the differences between comets and asteroids is that comets travel extremely fast, much faster than asteroids, and therefore they pack a great deal of kinetic energy. The scientists who exposed the cataclysm that brought the dinosaurs to extinction began with evidence from a layer in the soil, a layer of earth, a very blackened, burnt layer of earth, which contained what scientists refer to as impact proxies, the kind of chemical and molecular results of a powerful impact which is bringing great heat and great shock. And they include iridium, carbon microspherules, nanodiamonds, shocked quartz, and melt glass. You know, when the nuclear explosions were first set off, when they were testing nuclear bombs in America, they found that the heat was so great that it would turn sand into glass. And in these layers of soil, they found the same kind of features that they found in powerful nuclear explosions. So there's that impact spherule layer. That was the first clue that something terrible had happened to the world 65 million years ago. But the scientists, they were a father and son team, Luis and Walter Alvarez, who made this discovery. For the first 10 years, when they proposed this discovery, they were subjected to the most savage and severe attacks from other scientists. Other scientists refused to believe that such a cataclysm could have occurred, and they wanted to find some other explanation. And they kept saying, you know, you've shown us the impact proxies, the nanodiamonds, the carbon spherules, and so on, but you have to show us the crater before we'll believe you. And it took them 10 years, but eventually they found the crater. The crater is in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's deeply buried beneath the Gulf of Mexico, partly beneath the Yucatan Peninsula and partly in the Gulf of Mexico itself. Since the discovery of that crater, there's been no more argument, and it's generally accepted that it was a comet or an asteroid that made the dinosaurs extinct. These extinction-level events, these world-changing events, change everything. Of course, this is a joke, but they turned what happened with this event was it turned dinosaurs into chickens. It was that bad. Because chickens are all that's left of the dinosaur line. Chickens and birds in general, the huge creatures became extinct. At the same time that when the dinosaurs were masters of the world, skulking in the primeval forests was a little mammal. Looked like this. It was a kind of shrew. But that mammal is ancestral to all of us. What happened when the dinosaurs were made extinct was that the mammals that had been going nowhere suddenly had an opportunity that they could expand into, and the mammalian line began to evolve very rapidly, and so that's why we say, meet your 65-million-year-old mother. It's a fact. The human race would not be here if the dinosaurs had not been swept out of the way. So these extinction-level events are world-changing events. NASA would like us not to be concerned about them. They say it's not a problem. Events of that kind only occur once every 100 million years. I wonder how NASA know that. I wonder how they know and can tell us that the universe is so Germanic in its timekeeping that every 100 million years exactly it sends a cataclysm, and otherwise there's no problem. Many scientists disagree with NASA's position, and I'm showing some of them here. The late Sir Fred Hoyle, Chandra Wickram Singh, Victor Klug, Bill Napier, for example. They disagree with NASA's comfortable position, and they suggest that actually the cosmic environment of the Earth is much more dangerous than NASA tell us, and that it has been more dangerous for a very long time. Here's a curious thing about comets. There is not a single culture in the world where the appearance of a comet in the sky is regarded as good news. It's always regarded as bad news. There seems to be a tradition coming down from deep prehistory that there's something very dangerous and negative and worrying about comets. And you know what? That's absolutely correct. And we know that now because of what took place in 1994. Many of you will remember the case of Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9, which hit the planet Jupiter in 1994, the entire event being photographed and filmed by NASA. What Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 did is what actually all comets do eventually. It broke up into many different fragments. The original large object broke up into more than 20 fragments. Some of these fragments may have been as much as 1 kilometer in diameter. And those 20 fragments all hit the planet Jupiter, a swarm of comet fragments. And those impacts with the planet Jupiter were absolutely devastating. If those impacts had been upon the Earth, none of us would be here today. The combined explosive power of the impacts was 300 gigatons. If you were to take the entire nuclear arsenal of the Earth and blow it up all at once, it would be just 6.4 gigatons. So we have to understand that we're dealing with a cataclysm on an almost unimaginable scale. And this is the moment when I would like to say, thank you, Jupiter. Because Jupiter is the guardian of our planet, the giant guardian of planet Earth. Jupiter, circling in the outer solar system with its huge gravity, draws in most of the comets that would hit the Earth. It's been a friend to our planet for a very, very, very long time. It keeps on taking blows that otherwise would hit us. But every now and then, a comet gets through, and gets through into the inner solar system and into an orbit that crosses the orbit of the Earth. And actually, we're seeing bits of former comets all the time. I think everybody has seen shooting stars, meteors. And what NASA are explaining here is what a meteor shower actually is. Whether we call them the Leonids or the Perseids or the Orionids or the Taurids, all meteor showers are the remnant of a former disintegrated comet. Each one was once a whole comet, and it broke up into multiple fragments, some large, some small, and those fragments are the meteor shower. And again, NASA says we shouldn't worry about the meteor showers because most of the fragments in them are very small and they're very unlikely to hit the Earth. But again, a number of scientists are in complete disagreement with NASA on this. And they draw attention in particular to what is called the Taurid meteor stream. And it's called the Taurid meteor stream because it appears to come towards us from the direction of the constellation of Taurus. When you look up in the sky and you see the shooting stars coming in, they seem to be coming from the direction of the constellation of Taurus. Of course, they are not coming from Taurus. They're in the solar system, but visually that's where they appear to come from. We had an encounter with an object from the Taurid meteor stream in 1908. And fortunately, that encounter took place over an uninhabited area of Russia. It took place over Siberia. It's called the Tunguska event. And it was a bit of the former giant comet that made up the Taurid meteor stream. It wasn't even a large bit. It was roughly a diameter of between 100 and 200 meters. But what it did was it flattened 80 million trees across an area of more than 2,000 square kilometers. This object did not even hit the Earth. It exploded in the sky. But 80 million trees across 2,000 square kilometers of Siberia were completely destroyed. 2,000 square kilometers is bigger than the city of London. And if that object had exploded over any major city on Earth, we would all be very concerned about the Taurid meteor stream today. But because, fortunately, it exploded over Siberia and nobody was killed, very little attention has been paid to it. This is a graphic. The Taurid meteor stream is, you can envisage it as a giant tube of debris. And within that tube, there are many different filaments or threads of debris. And it's 30 million kilometers wide. And the Earth passes through it twice a year, in June and again in November. And each passage takes 12 and a half days. So for 12 and a half days, twice a year, we are in interaction with objects in the torrid meteor stream. And yes, many of those objects are small, dust-sized objects. But known objects within it include Comet Encke, which is 5 kilometers in diameter, Comet Rudnicki, which is 5 kilometers in diameter, Comet Olgiato, 2 kilometers in diameter, and in fact, 19 of the brightest near-Earth objects are in the torrid meteor stream. A very detailed astronomical study has been made of the torrid meteor stream, and this article, published in the monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society in the UK, presents the conclusions. And the conclusions are that about 20,000 years ago, a very large comet got past Jupiter, and it entered the inner solar system. And it entered the inner solar system on an orbit that crosses the orbit of the Earth. For the next 8,000 years, nothing very much happened. The Earth and the comet kept missing each other, and the comet began to break up into multiple fragments, making it much more likely that there would be an encounter. And that encounter occurred roughly 12,900 or 12,800 years ago, when many different fragments of that comet hit the Earth, creating a gigantic cataclysm on Earth. And just as the astronomers have been studying the torrid meteor stream, so also a group of geologists and earth scientists have been studying the consequences on the ground. And I'm showing some of these individuals here, and they include some very major and leading mainstream scientists. This is not, fringe material that I'm talking about here. I'm talking about mainstream science done by leading scientists in their field. And they started out investigating a mystery. And the mystery is to do with the last ice age. 21,300 years ago, approximately, the last ice age reached its maximum extent. At that point, we had gigantic ice sheet covering North America and Greenland, and a gigantic ice sheet covering northern Europe, with other ice sheets elsewhere. Now, of course, ice is frozen water. And what happens is that during an ice age is that the water that evaporates from the ocean falls and freezes as ice. And the result is that sea level gets much lower. So at the height of the ice age, when you had these two huge ice sheets, there was, for example, no Red Sea, there was no Persian Gulf, Australia was joined to New Guinea, the Malaysian Peninsula and Indonesia were a huge continent-sized landmass, because sea level was 120 meters lower than it is today. It was very cold at the last glacial maximum. The world was a freezing and inhospitable place. But then it began to warm up. And the warming by 14,000 years ago was bringing the world almost to the temperature that it's at today. And then suddenly, 12,800 years ago, global temperature plunged. There was a sudden, massive deep freeze took place. And that deep freeze lasted for 1,200 years, from 12,800 years ago until 11,600 years ago. And then global temperatures shot up again. And the last of the ice sheets melted into the sea. And the interesting thing is that when we're taught about the story of the origins of civilization, the whole story is set in this period, after the Younger Dryas, and nobody's really paying much attention to what happened before it. It's like a punctuation mark in the story of humanity. This episode that geologists call the Younger Dryas was accompanied by a mass die-off of animal species, particularly the megafauna. The woolly rhinos, the mammoths, the mastodons, they all died off between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. And the epicenter of the cataclysm was the Americas. North and South Americas suffered the worst extinctions that took place anywhere in the world. But it was global. This extinction was not confined to the Americas. It was all over the world. And lo and behold, just as was the case with the dinosaurs, the first evidence for what happened takes the form of a layer in the soil, exactly as was the case with the extinction of the dinosaurs, except the extinction of the dinosaurs was 65 million years ago, and this soil layer is just 12,800 years ago. And it's full of exactly the same impact proxies, the iridium, the nanodiamonds, the melt glass, and so on and so forth. And it's called the Younger Dryas boundary layer. I don't expect you to read these papers. I'm just putting them up on the screen to make it clear to you that we're dealing with something serious here. The work of these scientists has been published in all of the major peer-reviewed scientific journals, from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences to the Journal of Geology, to Nature, to Scientific Reports, and so on and so forth. This one from 2014, for example, in the Journal of Geology, is identifying a nanodiamond-rich layer across 3 continents consistent with major cosmic impact 12,800 years before the present. This study is very important because it indicates the time frame under which the disaster unfolded. You know, there were some questions. Could it have been an event that unfolded over 200 or 300 years? What this study shows is that this event unfolded in a single terrible day and night. Within a 24-hour period, the Earth was struck by this huge cataclysm, and it affected more than 50 million square kilometers of the Earth's surface. North America was the heart of it, but it affected Europe, and the furthest east they found evidence of impacts is actually in Syria. And again, more recent work this is from 2013, this is from 2017. The presence of platinum in the Greenland ice cores speaks eloquently of a comet impact. And now that same platinum layer has been found across North America as well. And platinum is very rare in the Earth's crust, but it is common in asteroids and comets. So the evidence continues to mount, and now, at last, the sites of a number of craters are being identified. It's important to be clear that the primary impacts 12,800 years ago took place on the North American ice cap. That ice was 2 kilometers deep at that time. The impact hits the ice and it creates a crater in ice. And it explodes an enormous amount of ice out of the crater. But it doesn't leave much of a crater on land because the ice has absorbed most of the effect of the impact. Nevertheless, around the edges of the ice cap, more and more evidence is being found of craters dated to 12,800 years ago. Particularly promising is the Corosol crater, firmly dated to 12,800 years ago. So, although it remains controversial, I would say it's safe to say that 12,800 years ago, multiple fragments of a giant comet impacted the Earth. The evidence is that at least 4 of those fragments were object in the range of 1 kilometer in diameter, 2 kilometers in diameter, and that those impacts were concentrated on the North American ice cap, but the resulting climate disaster was worldwide. So you get your impacts on the ice cap, and one thing that happens when you get this tremendous shock and heat of an impact on ice, it's going to melt a lot of that ice, and it's going to melt it very, very fast. It sends that water into the ocean, but it also sends it south across the continental United States. And the evidence for that is very powerful on the land in North America, particularly if you go to northwest of the United States, the Pacific Northwest and the state of Washington in the Pacific Northwest, where there's a phenomenon geological phenomenon called the channeled scablands. And it's been recognized for a long time that this chaotic landscape was the result of flooding. But it's been very controversial as to what caused that flooding. I could spend hours going into the various theories, but I want to cut a long story short. And the mystery is solved entirely by the comet evidence. If you get multiple fragments of a large comet hitting the North American ice cap, it generates the heat that you would need to melt a large enough area of the ice cap to cause that landscape devastation. For example, this is a Google Earth image from the channeled scablands, and we're looking down here on a fossilized waterfall. That's one of the sections of the waterfall, and it also continues all the way around here. And that waterfall, the geologists have discovered, was formed, this whole landscape feature was formed within just 2 weeks. The water ran for 2 weeks and then stopped, leaving a dry, fossilized feature. This water here is just rainwater that has pooled at the bottom, but there is no water flow over the site now. So I'm with a fellow researcher, his name is Randall Carlson, and we're down at the bottom of one of the parts of that ancient fossilized waterfall. And here we are overlooking it. That's that fossilized waterfall. Now, it's difficult for you to get a sense of the size of this waterfall, but I think everybody's familiar with Niagara Falls, right? World famous Niagara Falls. So let's put Niagara Falls in this picture. That's Niagara Falls to scale with the rest of dry falls. And Niagara Falls is the result of more than 12,000 years of the work of the river, whereas dry falls were created in just 2 weeks. What is flowing over, what is creating this fossilized waterfall was a giant flood. And that giant flood was not just water. It was filled with whole forests that had been ripped up by their roots. It was filled with rubble and boulders and thick mud. And most of all, it was filled with icebergs, because the ice cap had been shattered and flooded, and icebergs broke off it. And so you're dealing with a slurry of thick, erosive material, which is cutting out the landscape and creating features like this. And then when the flood stops, the feature is left as a fossil. For example, this is the town of Wenatchee in the Pacific Northwest. Down here at the bottom of the valley, and up here at the top of the valley. The top of the valley is 500 feet above the bottom of the valley. But this rock lying here doesn't come from this area. It comes from more than 100 kilometers further north. How did it get there? How did it end up on the side of this valley? And it's a really big rock. That's me standing on top of it. Actually, this rock is calculated to weigh 18,000 tons. And it got there in an iceberg the size of an oil tanker. That iceberg was carried on the floodwaters 500 feet deep. It caught against the valley side and it was trapped. As the floodwaters receded, the iceberg was left on the valley side. The ice melted away and exposed this huge boulder that it was carrying. Many icebergs contain rocks. And it's not alone. In that part of North America, right across the landscape, you can see thousands of giant iceberg rafted rocks like this. This one, they actually call this Boulder Park, because there's so many of these huge rocks, each one of which was carried there in an iceberg, and each one of which testifies to the gigantic scale of the cataclysm that swept North America. We've all been to the beach, and we all know what current ripples are. As the tide goes out, the water creates patterns on the sand. And the patterns are quite small. You might have, they might be a few centimeters high and a few meters in length. But if we go to the Pacific Northwest, to the Camas Prairie in America, we find current ripples that are on a truly gigantic scale. You know, nature is fractal. What it does at a small scale, it can also repeat at a large scale. And it repeated it at a large scale on the Camas Prairie. We're in the middle of the Camas Prairie here. That's a car. Those are the ripples. And that's just to give you a sense of the scale of this. We must imagine the most forceful and enormous flood of water that is capable of creating ripples that are 30 feet high and 300 feet in length. And in fact, we've been talking about this part of North America, but the evidence for the disaster continues all the way across North America. Whether we're talking about the St. Croix River in Minnesota with these gigantic potholes, or whether we're talking about the Finger Lakes of New York State, they're all the results of flooding. And a very recent study has drawn attention to something else that had not been considered properly before, which is to do with precisely what happens when you have a massive impact on an ice cap. The Laurentide ice sheet, an impact around here, would excavate a crater in the ice and would send out on ballistic trajectories ice boulders, which would be cast off in all directions round about. And the interesting thing is that here are the Carolinas, North Carolina and South Carolina, and here is Nebraska. And the earth of Nebraska and the earth of the Carolinas is similar. It's quite soft. And published in the journal Geomorphology is a study that connects this to the comet impacts. Here are the Carolina bays. There are thousands of them, these elliptical marks on the landscape. And that's what they look like from the air. And actually you can see that the Carolina bays are all oriented in a particular direction. They're oriented from the northwest to the southeast. But other similar formations are found more than 1,000 miles to the west. And those are the Nebraska rainwater basins, and they're oriented from the northeast to the southwest. So this is a normal photograph, but when you put LiDAR over it, you can see the features in Nebraska very clearly. The same elliptical patterns as you see in the Carolinas, but oriented from the northeast to the southwest instead of in the other direction. So there's the Nebraska rainwater basins, oriented from the northeast to the southwest, and there's the Carolina bays oriented in the other direction. And the explanation is very simple, that the explosion of the ice here sent ice fragments in this direction and in this direction, and that accounts for the elliptical nature of the bays and for the different orientation of those in Nebraska and those in the Carolinas. And it appears that the impact that caused this was over what is now Michigan, and the evidence is very strong that the Carolina bays and the Nebraska rainwater basins are yet another result of those comet impacts 12,800 years ago. I don't expect you to read all of this, but Zamora's conclusion is that the continental United States were devastated by these impacts. That the food chain was destroyed as we get this crushed ice over half of the United States. It's freezing cold, the food chain is destroyed, animals die out, human beings die out. It's a cataclysm almost beyond belief. The water didn't only go south across North America, it also went into the ocean, into the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. But the floodwater, the icy floodwater, entering the Atlantic Ocean 12,800 years ago had an extraordinary effect. I think we've all heard of the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream takes warm water from tropical regions and takes it up to cold northern regions and then recirculates it, and it's part of the central heating system of our planet, if you like. And what that icy meltwater did was it interrupted the Gulf Stream. It stopped the Gulf Stream completely for 1,200 years. And that's why the world got incredibly cold then. But then 11,600 years ago, after those 1,200 years had passed, the Earth warmed up again very suddenly. And this, just as the beginning was a cataclysm, so also the end of the Younger Dryas was a cataclysm. And it was accompanied by an enormous sea level rise as the last ice sheets collapsed into the ocean. And the late Sir Fred Hoyle, the astrophysicist, professor of astronomy at Cambridge University, suggested that this was caused by an interaction with the same torrid meteor stream. Other objects fell out of the torrid meteor stream. In 12,800 years ago, the impacts were on ice. 11,600 years ago, the impacts were in a major ocean, almost certainly the Pacific Ocean. This had two effects. Firstly, tidal waves and enormous flooding all around the world. Secondly, a huge amount of water vapor cast up into the upper atmosphere, which creates a greenhouse effect and accounts for the sudden rise in temperatures that took place then. So those are the key dates. 12,800 years ago, it begins with a cataclysm. 11,600 years ago, it ends with a cataclysm. We know a number of interesting things about 11,600 years ago. That is the date that geologists identify with what they call meltwater pulse 1b, a sudden release of an enormous quantity of meltwater into the world ocean, truly a global flood. And secondly, 11,600 years ago is the date that Plato gives us for the destruction and submergence of the lost civilization of Atlantis. Now, archaeologists tell us that there was no such thing as Atlantis, and they say that Plato made the story of Atlantis up. By the way, we should be clear that Plato is the single source for Atlantis, the single surviving source. Any other sources for Atlantis are derivative of Plato, but Plato is the pure original source. Plato tells us a number of things about Atlantis. He tells us that it had advanced architecture, that it had advanced agriculture, that it had advanced navigational, shipbuilding, and seagoing skills, that it had advanced social and political organization. But then Plato tells us that, first of all, Atlantis was a beautiful civilization. It was kind, it was generous, it nurtured other civilizations, and it felt that what mattered in the human creature was our spirit. It nurtured the development of spirit, but then corruption entered in as the millennia passed. And Atlantis went from being a kind and generous spiritual place to being a very materialistic place. It became a power that imposed its power on other peoples around the world. It began to dominate and control the world. And there's a ringing phrase in Plato. He tells us that Atlantis ceased to carry its prosperity with moderation. In other words, they had become very rich and they were very boastful and arrogant about it. And Plato suggests that this is why the universe struck Atlantis down with a great flood. And that we learn that in a single dreadful day and night, Atlantis was swallowed up by the sea and vanished. And mankind had to begin again like children, with no memory of what went before. I said that Plato gives us a date, and he does. Plato says that he got the story through his family line from the famous Greek lawmaker Solon, who was an ancestor of Plato. And Solon, it's a well-established historical fact, visited Egypt around the year 600 BC, some century and a half before Plato's time. Visited Egypt around 600 BC and visited the Temple of Neith at Sais in the Delta, which no longer exists today. And there, Solon had an encounter with Egyptian priests. And those Egyptian priests told him that the civilization of Egypt was a legacy of an earlier civilization, and that civilization was Atlantis. but that unfortunately Atlantis had been destroyed in a giant global flood. And Solon asked the priests, when did this flood occur? And the priests answered, 9,000 years ago. That was in 600 BC. In other words, we're talking about 9,600 BC, which, give or take a dozen or so years, is 11,600 years ago. Archaeologists say that Plato made the whole story of Atlantis up. But if he made it up, he was astonishingly precise with the latest scientific information on the end of the Ice Age and the very significance of the date 11,600 years ago. Egyptologists will tell you that there is no mention of Atlantis in any ancient Egyptian text. And to a certain extent, they're correct. You cannot find the word Atlantis in any ancient Egyptian text. But can you find an account of a sacred island of the gods, which is destroyed in a flood cataclysm, leaving a few survivors who seek to restart civilization? And the answer is yes, definitely. You can find that account. And where you find it is here, at the Temple of Horus at Edfu in Upper Egypt. Now, this temple is not very old. This is a Ptolemaic temple. It dates to about 300 BC. But what we know is that it stands on the site of an earlier temple, which in turn stood on the site of an even earlier temple. And in fact, archaeologists have been able to trace these temples back into the deep pre-dynastic period of Egypt. The Temple of Horus at Edfu inherited the archive of the earlier temples. And that archive included material that was written on animal skins that was falling to pieces. And the priests of this temple decided that they would save that information. They would copy it, extracts from it. They would copy it and they would carve it into the walls of this temple. And that's what they did. As the temple was built, they carved the so-called Edfu building texts on the walls of the temple, particularly between the inner and outer enclosure walls. And this is just to give you a sense of what the deeply inscribed Edfu building texts look like. And broadly speaking, what they're telling us of is of an island that was called the homeland of the primeval ones. And it was destroyed in a great flood. But there were survivors, and the Edfu texts tell us that some of those survivors came to Egypt. And there they set about trying to rebuild civilization. And they established what are referred to as primeval mounds all over the land of Egypt. And these primeval mounds were a kind of cosmic blueprint. They were to be the site of all future temples and pyramids that would be built in Egypt. No structure should be built on a place that was not sanctified by the primeval ones. And there's a reference to a serpent in the sky which assaults the island and pierces it and causes the flood. And many ancient cultures spoke of comets as serpents. It's clear from the Edfu texts that the survivors of this cataclysm went to many places, not just to Egypt. There's a specific word that is used in the texts for the wanderings of the survivors and how they traveled all over the world and how their project was to give a rebirth or reincarnation to their destroyed civilization. They wanted to start it again. And therefore they settled amongst less advanced people and began to teach them their skills. And that's why it's interesting that 11,600 years ago, as well as being Plato's date for the destruction of Atlantis, as well as being the date for Meltwater Pulse 1b and the end of the Ice Age, is also the date that archaeologists now tell us that megalithic architecture and agriculture were invented at a place called Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Göbekli Tepe is an incredibly important archaeological site that is changing everything we know about our past. And it's up here in Anatolia, in Turkey. And this is an aerial view looking down on one area of the excavations. And I just want to compare it with Stonehenge. When we think of megalithic sites, everyone thinks of Stonehenge. Well, first of all, Stonehenge is much smaller than Göbekli Tepe. And secondly, Stonehenge is 7,000 years younger than Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is 11,600 years old. So here's the kind of fantasy that archaeologists are working with on Göbekli Tepe. They tell us that 11,600 years ago, a group of hunter-gatherers who had never created any kind of architecture before woke up one morning equipped with the skills to create what turns out to be the largest and most sophisticated megalithic site ever built on Earth. They'd had no practice, no experience, but one day they just knew how to do it. And as well as that, that same morning, they knew how to invent agriculture and to domesticate plants. It sounds like a fairy tale to me. I think what we're looking at is a transfer of technology. I think that we are looking at the survivors of a lost civilization who came and settled amongst the hunter-gatherers at Göbekli Tepe, created this project as an initiation device, and began to teach them the skills of agriculture. And Göbekli Tepe is an amazing and eerie place on a truly gigantic scale, and many of the pillars there are beautifully and mysteriously carved. And here I am in 2013, and I'm talking to Klaus Schmidt, who was the discoverer of Göbekli Tepe and the principal excavator of Göbekli Tepe for the German Archaeological Institute. Unfortunately, Klaus died of a heart attack in 2014, but he was very kind to me on my first visit to Göbekli Tepe in 2013. Generally, archaeologists don't like me, and when I turn up at the site, they either throw me out or walk away themselves. But Klaus knew who I was, and he actually spent 3 days of his precious time really showing me around the site very carefully, and I'm enormously grateful to him. He's making 2 points to me here. The first is that Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. The site ran for 1,000 years. It started 11,600 years ago, and roughly 10,600 years ago, it was closed down. It was not destroyed, it wasn't vandalized, it wasn't damaged. This is not sediment. We must envisage teams of hundreds of people with buckets filled with rubble and stones, and they're pouring them in on top of the stone pillars, and they're covering them up completely. And they don't stop there, but they actually create a hill over the top of the site. And that's what Göbekli Tepe means in the Turkish language. It means pot-bellied hill. And for thousands and thousands of years, nobody knew that anything was buried underneath it until Klaus Schmidt got to grips with it. The other thing he's telling me is that they've only really started work on the site. They've been over the whole site with ground-penetrating radar. And what they know is that there are hundreds and hundreds of pillars still under the ground, which await excavation. And that by any standards, when you take into account the still buried parts of Göbekli Tepe, we are looking at the largest megalithic site on Earth. And that megalithic site is in a very interesting place. It's between the headwaters of the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, which of course brings us to Mesopotamia and to the ancient historical civilization of Sumer. And interestingly, the Sumerians, the Mesopotamians, had a long tradition concerning a global flood, concerning a cataclysm, and concerning the individuals, the 7 sages, who brought the gifts of civilization. And they're often depicted like this figure, oddly with a fish on his head. And then he's holding this funny little bag. And actually, they all hold the same peculiar little bag, which I refer to as a man bag. They're all carrying these man bags. And they were remembered as teaching advanced astronomical and geonetic knowledge including all the skills necessary for planning and setting out a city. So we see these peculiar little bags in Mesopotamia, but oddly enough, we also see them in Central America. This is the oldest image of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, from an Olmec site in the Yucatan. And Quetzalcoatl was also a bringer of civilization, exactly like the seven sages of Mesopotamia, and he is depicted inside a feathered serpent, holding the same sort of bag that we see in the Mesopotamian imagery. And those bags also turn up on top of one of the pillars at Göbekli Tepe. And in the case of Göbekli Tepe, we know that they're 11,600 years old. I suggest that we're looking at the badge of office of a brotherhood of civilizers who traveled the world trying, but not quite succeeding, to restart civilization. And of course, Mesopotamia is in the same general area as Egypt. So let's go to ancient Egypt, to the pyramids and the amazing Great Sphinx of Giza. The Great Pyramid is really an absolutely astonishing thing. It weighs 6 million tons. Sorry, I have to give the figure in feet, but it's 481 feet tall. Its footprint is 13 acres. I can't give you that in hectares, but it's enormous. And this whole huge structure, the last surviving wonder of the ancient world, is so precisely positioned in its alignment to true north, south, east, and west that the error is just 3/60ths of a single degree of true north. We're not talking about magnetic north, which you see on your compass and which varies from decade to decade. We're talking about true astronomical north. The precision of the Great Pyramid's alignment to true north tells us, whoever made it, that they were masterful astronomers, because you can't get this level of alignment without very precise astronomy, and no modern building would even bother to have that level of alignment. Something else, if you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by a very special number, which is 43,200, the figure that you get is the size of the polar radius of the Earth. And if you measure the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by the same number, 43,200, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. Actually, Egyptologists know this, but they say it's a coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence. Long before our ancestors in Europe even knew that the Earth was a planet, the Great Pyramid encoded the dimensions of our planet on a scale of 1 to 43,200. Now, the Egyptologists say, well, so what? I mean, what's significant about 43,200? Surely it's just a random number. You know, there's no meaning to this. It's entirely coincidental. But that's not true. The number 43,200 is a highly significant number. It belongs to a sequence of numbers that have been encoded in ancient myths since myths began. And those numbers derive from a key motion of the Earth. You see, the Earth, as well as spinning on its own axis, over a period of just under 26,000 years, it also wobbles on its axis. And the result of that is that the pole star, which is presently Polaris, has not always been Polaris and will not always be Polaris. It was, for example, Thuban in the constellation of Draco. Sometimes the extended north pole of the Earth just points at empty space and there is no pole star. The other effect of precession is observable on the horizon, and it concerns the 12 constellations of the zodiac, which in ancient times were thought to define the character of the age in which we live. We live in the age of Pisces. For about the last 2,000 years, if you were to get up before dawn on the spring equinox, 21st of March, if you were to get up before dawn and look perfectly due east, you would see the constellation of Pisces lying on the horizon in the place where the sun will rise. But Pisces has not always been there. Because the Earth is the viewing platform from which we observe the stars, this wobble on the axis of the Earth shifts the constellations of the zodiac around behind the sun. And were you to go back before the time of Christ, you would find that it was the constellation of Aries that housed the sun for the 2,000 years before the time of Christ. And for the 2,000 years before that, it was the constellation of Taurus that housed the sun. And we all know what's coming next. We live in the dawning of the age of Aquarius. Pisces is reaching its end, and we're entering the age of Aquarius. And all this happens because of this motion of the Earth, and it creates this visual illusion in the sky. The point about it is that this motion unfolds at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. And the number 43,200 is a multiple of 72. If the Great Pyramid was a scale model of the Earth on a scale of, say, 1 to 57,406, I might accept that it was a coincidence. But when it's 1 to 43,200, not only do we have a scale model of the Earth, but we have the scale itself defined by a key motion of the Earth. And in my opinion, that completely rules out the possibility of coincidence. And it's not only my opinion. I'm sure this book is available in Italian. It's an incredibly difficult book to read. It's by Professor Giorgio de Santillana, who was the professor of the history of science at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and his colleague Hertha von Deschen from the University of Frankfurt. And what they have documented is a very ancient knowledge of this astronomical phenomenon that causes the Earth's axis to wobble. And they have found the numbers relating to precession, multiples of 72, in ancient myths and traditions all around the world that go back far beyond the time when precession was formally discovered. And they trace the origins of the system to some, quote, almost unbelievable ancestor civilization of prehistoric antiquity that first dared to understand the world as created according to number, measure, and weight. So the scale that is used is a highly significant scale. It's not a random scale, and we cannot be dealing with a coincidence. Something else about the Giza monuments, as well as giving us a scale model of the Earth, with a scale defined by a key motion of the Earth itself, they also give us a date. This is the Great Sphinx, and the Great Sphinx looks perfectly to the east, perfectly due east. This is what you see if you climb up illegally on the back of the Sphinx at most times of the year. That's the back of the Sphinx's head. If you were there at the summer solstice, the 21st of June, the sun would be rising over here. If you were there at the winter solstice, the 21st of December, the sun would be rising over here. So far to the south of east on the winter solstice, far to the north of east on the summer solstice. But if you go there on the equinox, 21st of March, and also the 21st of September, and you stand behind the back of the Sphinx's head, you see what the Sphinx is seeing. The Sphinx is looking directly at the rising sun on the equinox. And that makes the Sphinx what archaeoastronomers call an equinoctial marker. It is designed to connect heaven and earth, above and below, on that special day, on the equinox. It's a marriage of heaven and earth. And if you were the ancient Egyptians, who were very aware of the skies, and you were going to create an equinoctial marker in 2500 BC, which is the date that archaeologists say the Sphinx was made, then you should have made your Sphinx in the shape of a bull, because this was the age of Taurus. The Pyramid Age is the age of Taurus. But weirdly, the Sphinx is in the shape of a lion. And we believe that originally, I and my colleagues, that the Sphinx was entirely a lion, and that in ancient Egyptian times, its lion head was cut down into the human head that it has today. That's why the head is so small by comparison with the rest of the body of the Sphinx. We think that the original leonine head was heavily eroded and damaged, and the pharaohs decided to recarve it. So the interesting thing, because of that phenomenon that changes the positions of the stars, is that if you go back far enough in time, you will come to a moment which is the age of Leo. We live in the age of Pisces, the age of Aquarius is coming, we know about the age of Aries, the age of Taurus. The age of Leo was when the constellation of Leo, the Sphinx's celestial counterpart, would lie due east on the horizon in direct line with the gaze of the Sphinx, an hour before dawn on the spring equinox. And then as the sun rises and the sun bisects the horizon, you find that the constellation of Orion is lying due south on the meridian, with the three belt stars of the constellation of Orion in the pattern of the three great pyramids on the ground. And this, of course, is the remarkable breakthrough work of my amazingly gifted genius colleague, Robert Bauval, rightly world famous for his Orion correlation discovery. This particular combination only occurs between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. So what confronts us at Giza is a three-dimensional representation of the equinoctial sky as it would have looked throughout that period from 12,800 to 11,600 years ago. And we now know that that was a period marked by dramatic earth changes. It may seem odd that some ancient culture would have used gigantic monuments and the stars to spell out a date. But supposing you wanted to send a message to the future, and supposing you couldn't be sure that in 10 or 12,000 years' time, anybody would speak your language. And indeed, even if you wrote it down on a document which nobody might be able to translate, perhaps the document would not survive. What you want is a way to send a message to the future that clearly spells out a date. And the way to do that is to use the motions of the stars and the fixed cycles in which they change. And it happened at Giza, and weirdly enough, it happens at the Hoover Dam in North America. I mean, who gives a damn about the Hoover Dam, really? But interestingly enough, the architect responsible for the Hoover Dam built a star map into it. And he built that star map into it. He froze the skies above the dam on the date of completion of the dam because he believed that in remote ages to come, intelligent people with knowledge of precession would be able to discern the astronomical time of the dam's dedication. So if we're doing that with big works of architecture in our time, there's no reason why it shouldn't have been done in the past as well. Göbekli Tepe, the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, really changes and should change everything about our view of megalithic architecture. Not so long ago, this huge megalithic complex was found in the Sicilian Channel, and it's been covered by seawater for more than 9,000 years. Before Göbekli Tepe, there would have been no context in which to place such a site. I'm also interested, when we look at the general shape of Göbekli Tepe, how similar it is to the megaliths on the Spanish island of Menorca. The same T-shaped pattern is seen there. And I'm wondering whether the megaliths on Menorca have been misdated. There is a problem with dating stone architecture and megalithic sites. There isn't really a scientific test that can tell you when a piece of stone was cut. Radiocarbon dating doesn't do it. Radiocarbon dating dates organic material. So when an archaeologist tells you that a particular megalith is a particular age, what they're actually telling you is that they found a piece of charcoal or carbon or bone underneath the megalith. They dated that and they then conclude that the megalith is the same age as that organic material. But it's possible to get artificially young dates because of this. Organic material can intrude from younger levels. And I think that Göbekli Tepe requires us to consider the dating of every megalithic site on Earth. For example, the general appearance of Göbekli Tepe is very similar to the appearance of the megalithic temples of the island of Malta. Yet the megalithic temples on the island of Malta are supposed to be at most 5,500 to 6,000 years old. Is it possible that they too are much older than we've been taught, and that mistakes have been made regarding the dating of these temples? I'm on Malta with a researcher named Anton Mifsud. He's actually the chief pediatrician at the main hospital in Valletta, but he's also a very keen amateur archaeologist. And he has made some astonishing discoveries, and he's been a great thorn in the flesh to the archaeological establishment in Malta. And what we're sitting in here are the so-called cart ruts of Malta, which are thought to date to the same period as the temples. I mean, I have to say, some cart, some ruts, they're supposed to be just 5,000 years old. But if you go diving off Malta, in fact off this very point as we did, you will find that the cart ruts continue underwater. They continue underwater down to a depth which means that they were last above water more than 12,000 years ago. And this raises huge questions, I think, over the antiquity of all the monuments of Malta. There are remarkable flood myths in India. And as we can see, India during the Ice Age was rather different in appearance from India today. Particularly strong is the story of Manu, effectively the Indian Noah. Manu and the 7 rishis, the 7 wise men, the 7 sages, who were rescued from the flood by the god Vishnu. There are authentic Indian traditions in South India of a lost land that lay to the south of India, a lost continent that is referred to as Kumari Kandam. And we can now say, with the evidence we have from the end of the Ice Age, that India did indeed extend much further to the south during the Ice Age than it does today because of those lowered sea levels. And here are 2 particular places in India where we went diving to follow up traditions. One of them is Pumpahar in Tamil Nadu, and the other is Mahabalipuram, also in Tamil Nadu. Before I show you the pictures, I'll have to say that diving in the coastal waters off India is quite a dirty business. The waters are full of stuff, and it makes visibility very, very poor. So we did our best. It's my wife Santa, of course, who takes all of the photographs, and here is what we find underwater off Pumpahar. Now, we knew it was there because India's National Institute of Oceanography had already found the site, and they were absolutely confident it's a man-made site, and the problem is it's more than 12,000 years old. They took us there, we went diving with them, and indeed there's no doubt that we are dealing with blocks of stone and a man-made site. Next, we wanted to go diving at Mahabalipuram. My wife Santa speaks the Tamil language as her first language, and we became interested in Mahabalipuram years ago, in fact going right back to 1992, where we started talking to Tamil fishermen on the beach, and they told us amazing stories about a whole city that lay underwater offshore of Mahabalipuram. And we said, have you told anybody about this? And they said, yeah, we tell everybody, but nobody believes us. They said, as a matter of fact, we'd like that city cleared away because we keep catching our nets on it. We have to send down free divers to release them. It took us years to get permission from the Indian government to go diving at Mahabalipuram. And they insisted that we have an official exploration organization with us. So we involved the Scientific Exploration Society from England. And off we went in 2002 to India, South India. And as you can see, it was a very high-tech expedition. And the fishermen took us out a kilometer from shore and said, get in the water here. And we get in the water, and immediately, there's no doubt, we are dealing, this is a wall sticking up through the sand. Here's a wall with a standout feature. I'm putting my diving knife into the gap between two blocks here. There's no doubt whatsoever that we are dealing with a man-made site. After we had made that discovery, we were not allowed to return to the site. The Indian government has kept the site under very tight control. It has tried to deny that there is anything there at all. I don't quite understand why. It may be to do with nationalism, because we were a group of foreigners who were involved in the discovery. The matter is still playing out. Go to Japan. There are, again, incredible traditions of a flood and of underwater structures. There's a legend of a fisherman who rescues the daughter of a sea god, and she takes him to her underwater kingdom. Then there's another fisherman who descends to the bottom of the sea in a special basket and sees a city. And in Japanese tradition, the kingdom of the sea god is located in a place hidden from the sight of man, somewhere amongst the islands of the Ryukyu archipelago. This is the Ryukyu archipelago. So the Japanese traditions state quite definitely that the kingdom of the sea god, an underwater city, is located somewhere in the Ryukyu archipelago. And the most southwestern island of the Ryukyu archipelago is the island of Yonaguni. We will come to it in a moment. What I want to draw your attention to now is that above water in Japan, there are also many megalithic sites. Most people don't know this. Japan is a megalithic culture. This one is above Asuka in central Japan, and you can see it's beautifully cut and shaped. But if we go around the other side, you can also see that it's unfinished. They didn't finish the workmanship here, but we can see how they cut it. They would cut these vertical grooves and then the horizontal grooves, and had they finished the work, they would have smoothed off these areas and left it polished like the other side, but they didn't do so. The reason I'm interested in this stone cutting technique is that exactly the same stone cutting technique is found 40 meters underwater in the Ryukyu archipelago at the island of Yonaguni. That same system of vertical cuts and horizontal cuts. And then I'm going to show you a range of underwater structures off the island of Yonaguni. All of them at about 30 meters depth, all of them underwater for about 12,000 years. There's a ramp here. This is natural rock, but this seems to be an enclosure wall surrounding a curved ramp. I'm here about to swim through a tunnel. When I go into the tunnel, I find that it's megalithic, that the tunnel consists of megaliths heaped on top of one another. And when I come to the end of the tunnel, I see directly ahead of me two huge megaliths lying side by side. The official position is that these megaliths are entirely natural and that they must have fallen into place from a cliff above the site. The fact that there is no cliff immediately above this place doesn't seem to bother the official position. This is the context. There's the two megaliths, and this is undoubtedly natural, a huge natural outcrop here. But let's continue in this direction and see what's over here. And what's over here is a series of extraordinary terraces. And again, because they're more than 12,000 years old, archaeologists say they have to be natural. They can't be man-made, because no human beings were capable of such work 12,000 years ago. But that's putting the cart before the horse. That's putting the theory before the facts. To my eye, and I've done more than 200 dives on this structure, we're obviously dealing with a man-made structure, and down below it is a pathway. And if you go down to that pathway, you can find that all of the rubble has been cleared to the side, so that the pathway is entirely clear. I'm showing this picture of an Olmec head from Mexico just to orient you to large sculpted human heads, because there's one in Japan at Yonaguni as well. And here I'm in the picture just for scale: the two eyes, the nose, the mouth, the eyes, the mouth. The eyes actually have pupils in them. And the head has a headdress at the front, and it's beautifully separated from the bedrock behind. And if we pull back from here, we see that the context has been cleared. There are even gutters cut into the base of the platform here. Other megaliths from Japan. This one is called Ishibutai. It looks like a classic European megalithic grave, but there it is in the heart of Japan. And Japan also has stone circles. This stone circle is from Hokkaido in northern Japan. This stone circle is from Shikoku in southern Japan. And sometimes the stone circles are very small and unimpressive, revealed only by excavation, semicircles of river stones that were laid down beside the larger stones. So it's interesting when you go to the Keramas off Okinawa and dive there, that you find the same pattern. You find the same semicircles of river stones, and you find giant stone circles on the seabed at a depth of 30 meters, submerged for more than 12,000 years. Central upright, surrounded by a spiral of other megaliths. The inner curve of the outer megalith matches the outer curve of the central megalith. If we go on from Japan to the island of Tinian, we can see huge megalithic structures there. Actually, Tinian was the island on which the Americans used as the base to fly the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. Go further east from Tinian, and you come to Micronesia. And in Micronesia, again at a depth of more than 30 meters, lying on the seabed, there are columns, exactly like those Tinian columns. And as we come up from the sea bottom, we start finding more curious features, and then obviously man-made features. And we come up higher, and that's where we've been diving. That's the bay, and it's in front of Nan Madol on the island of Ponape in Micronesia. And this whole bay, which was dry land during the Ice Age, is full of man-made structures. And that's what you find at the top. Archaeologists are only interested in dating this, the most recent structure. They haven't paid attention to the older submerged structures underwater. The building technique in Nan Madol involves the use of columnar basalt. This is basalt that forms naturally into a column-like form, but is very useful as a building material. If we go over to Indonesia, on the island of Java, there's a structure called Gunung Padang, which is built of the same materials and uses the same building techniques. There's Nan Madol, there is Gunung Padang. And I visited Gunung Padang several times with an Indonesian geologist, and his name is Danny Hilman Natawijaja. And he's in fact Indonesia's leading expert in megathrust earthquakes. He's a highly experienced geologist, but he's also interested in archaeology. And when he took a look at this site, which is supposed to be just 2,000 years old, his geological knowledge puzzled him. There was something about the site that didn't feel right. It stands on top of what was thought to be a natural hill. But Danny's view was, could this be a man-made hill? Could we be looking at some kind of pyramid here? So he brought in a team of fellow geologists, and they did a thorough survey of Gunung Padang using the latest remote sensing technology. And what they found is that this is just the most recent level of an extremely ancient structure that people have been working on for what appears to be more than 20,000 years. They put down drill cores and they brought up pieces of worked stone together with datable organic materials. And initially, the dates they started to get were not too disturbing, but then they got older and older. And we find dates of, you know, going back 28,000 years, 23,000 years. The site is very complicated. It appears to have been worked and reworked by many different cultures over many different periods of time for thousands and thousands of years. There are cavities inside this pyramid. In fact, there are 3 identifiable chambers within the pyramid, and obviously it's a matter of great importance to excavate it thoroughly. My second visit there was with the geologist Robert Schock from Boston University, and again with Danny Hillman. The evidence that Danny showed us that this is a man-made structure and that it's extremely old was very compelling. And in fact, the next step then for Danny was to get permission to excavate the structure. And he got actually the president of Indonesia at that time, President Susilo Yudhoyono. He got him to come to the site and he showed him the same material that he had shown us. And he said, can we have permission to excavate this site? And the president said, you bet, absolutely. Go ahead and excavate this site. This could be incredibly important for the history of mankind. Archaeologists didn't like it. They don't like it when other people get into their territory. They particularly didn't like the fact that they were dealing with a geologist. And they wanted the money that was going to be spent on excavating Gunung Padang to be spent elsewhere. Unfortunately, there was a change of president. The new president, on the 10th of October 2014, President Widodo, listened to the archaeologists. He stopped the excavations, and since 10th of October 2014, no further excavation has taken place at Gunung Padang. This is a great pity, because the entire area is a fascinating one. It was literally a continent-sized landmass that was above sea level at the end of the Ice Age, and that's underwater now. And what Danny is saying of Gunung Padang is it's older than 9,000 years. It could be more than 20,000 years. It's a strong case, but not an easy case. We're up against the world's belief. Let's change locations and move to the Middle East again, and to the Lebanon, where I am seated in a Roman temple. This is the Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek in the Lebanon. And behind it is the Temple of Bacchus. I love it that the Romans had a temple dedicated to the god of wine. There are 6 remaining columns of the Temple of Jupiter. There used to be 54 of them, but the others have been destroyed and fallen down on earthquakes. Now, I want you to look at a plan of Baalbek. This is the Temple of Jupiter. This is north, this is south, this is east, this is west. There is nothing megalithic about the Temple of Jupiter itself. But the wall that surrounds the Temple of Jupiter, that's very interesting. Let's look at the Temple of Jupiter first. We can tell the stuff it's made of because of excavations. It's built of pretty small blocks of stone. There are no megaliths there. You can see quite clearly in the temple platform. But if we go to that wall which stands separate from the temple, This is the south side of the wall. And there's the north side of the wall. I'm looking down on it from the top of the temple. We see huge megaliths. There's that megalithic wall, and there's the temple with much smaller blocks. And if we continue our journey and we come round to the west side, we can see that the megaliths get even bigger. In fact, these are just 3 stones. They're called the trilithon, and each one of those stones weighs 900 tons. Let's say that a large car, an SUV, weighs 2 tons. So you have to consider that each one of the 3 stones here is the equivalent in weight to 450 large motor cars. I'm pointing up at it. 1 stone, 2 stones, 3 stones, the trilithon. Really massive blocks of stone, so tightly fitted together you can't get a sheet of paper in the gaps between them. But even bigger stones remain in the quarry, about 2 kilometers away. I don't know why, but they call this one the stone of the pregnant woman. I'm standing on top of it. It weighs 1,000 tons. And it is cleanly separated from the bedrock beneath it. On the other side of the road, now used as a rubbish dump, unfortunately, is an even larger megalith. This one weighs 1,200 tons. The German Archaeological Institute have been excavating this site for 100 years. But it was only 2 years ago that they discovered this megalith, which previously was covered by sediment. This megalith has now been partially excavated. You can see the front end of it here. I'm standing on it here. And it's the largest of all. It weighs 1,400 tons. It's the view of archaeologists that the Romans did everything at Baalbek. It's the view of archaeologists that Romans made the Temple of Jupiter, and they also made the megalithic wall around the Temple of Jupiter, and they also quarried these blocks in the quarry, but then they found that although they could move blocks weighing 900 tons, they could not move blocks weighing 1,000 tons, let alone blocks weighing 1,200 or 1,400 tons. So the archaeological theory is that the Romans just left these blocks in the quarry. I have to say, in my opinion, that is a very un-Roman thing to do. The Romans were not wasteful. Even if the archaeologists are right, and they discovered that they couldn't move megaliths of this weight, having done all this work on them, they certainly would not have left them in the quarry. They would have cut them up, sliced them up like loaves of bread into smaller blocks, and used those smaller blocks in the construction of the quarry. My suggestion is the Romans never knew these blocks were there, that the whole thing was completely covered by sediment, just as this one still was until a couple of years ago, and that we are looking at the remains of prehistoric civilization. You find similar kinds of blocks up in the Peruvian Andes. This is Ollanta Tambo, about 12,000 feet above sea level in the Sacred Valley. And archaeologists like to say that all of the incredible stonework in the Andes and particularly in the Sacred Valley was the work of the Incas. We've all heard of the Incas. The Incas are a relatively recent civilization of South America. They really came into existence about 1300 AD, and they were brought to an end by the Spanish conquest in 1530s. But did the Incas really make everything? Did the Incas look at this incredible precision of stonework? the very precise and very fine jointing of the stones. The Incas are supposed to have done this only with other stones, with pounding balls. Stones about the size of your fist that you keep pounding the other stone, and eventually you get it so precise that you get a joint like that. To my mind, that's not a good explanation for how this work was done. And something else, what you find up in Cuzco and in the high Andes in general is a combination of different styles of workmanship. Beautiful workmanship like this, and then it's side by side with really bad workmanship like this. And the weird thing is that archaeologists say the Incas did it all. They did this, and they did this. Does that really make sense? For example, this is definitely an Inca structure. There's no doubt about it. We know it was made by the Incas. It's in Lake Titicaca. It's on the island of the Moon, and it's the palace where the selected virgins who would marry the Inca king, the Inca, were kept. It was very important to the Incas, and one would imagine that they would do their best work on such a site. So here is definite Inca workmanship. There is no record of who made this, but it's a completely different type of workmanship. I don't think the Incas made it. I think archaeologists are making a mistake. They're putting everything together, whereas in fact the Incas were a late-coming culture that simply built around and overbuilt and perhaps honored and respected much earlier structures that had already existed in the Andes. For example, this is definitely Inca work, but is this also the work of the Incas? And this altar here, is that also the work of the Incas? And Sacsayhuaman, up above the city of Cuzco, these amazing zigzag megalithic walls. Well, here's a group of school children with their teacher, and he's teaching them that the Incas made everything. The Incas made all of this. Look at this stone here. I'm standing beside it for scale. It weighs 360 tons. That's what happens when you put a stone like that on a modern truck. Okay, and that's Inca workmanship, but I don't think this is Inca workmanship. In fact, there is only one account of the Incas attempting to move a very large stone. And that account tells us that in the process, more than 3,000 people died. The stone eventually fell off the side of a mountain, and they were unable to bring it to this place. It suggests, again, that we're looking at a much earlier epoch of construction mixed up with later Inca work. And in fact, all around Sacsayhuaman, very strange landscape. The mountainsides have been cut and shaped and carved into all kinds of patterns. It's a really remarkable and bizarre place. And I am there with Jesus Gamarra. And Jesus Gamarra is himself a descendant of the Incas. He and his father before him have researched the megaliths of the Andes for the best part of a century between them. Jesus is 78 years old now. And the conclusion they have come to is that the Incas definitely did not make everything. If anybody had a vested interest in giving everything to the Incas, it would be Jesus. But he's honest, and he says, no, the Incas didn't do this. There was a much earlier culture that did the majority of this work. And that what the Incas did was they came along and they honored and respected the earlier sites by building their inferior workmanship around it. And you see this curious scooping and scalloping of the stones. And what Jesus is suggesting is that whichever remarkable ancient civilization created this site, they had a way of softening stone. And that's why you see these curious indentations, as though when the stone was soft, almost like clay or putty, you pressed something into it and left this indentation, these curious scrape marks, for example. We're still near the city of Cuzco here, but now let's go over to Tiwanaku in Bolivia. Again, gigantic stonework there, massive, massive blocks of stone. I can't put this into meters, but Tiwanaku is 14,000 feet above sea level. You know it when you're at that altitude. It's hard to breathe. You have to get acclimatized. You get terrible headaches. So how were people moving, blocks of stone that weigh hundreds of tons up at this altitude? And there's some very peculiar pieces. I mean, of course, with our alphabet, we recognize this as the letter H. We don't know what it looked like to the ancients of Tiwanaku, but this very precise sculpting of the stone is rather fascinating. And then if you take an aerial view, we're looking down on the Akapana pyramid, one of the key features of Tiwanaku, largely destroyed. And next to it, the so-called Kalasasea, which is a huge rectangular structure. And in the far corner of the Kalasasea, a feature called the Gateway of the Sun, which has been moved in modern times, but which originally stood dead center in the Kalasasea. This Kalasasea, the wall part of it, these bits, the wall, is an archaeological fantasy. The archaeologists reconstructed it according to how they thought it should have looked. But what was there originally were these huge megalithic columns. The stuff in between them has been put there by archaeologists. The megalithic columns were the original site. And we're looking down on the Kalasasea again. This Gateway of the Sun was originally positioned here. And still today, despite being moved, it seems to bear a relationship to the sun. We went there on the summer solstice. We had to be there at 4 o'clock in the morning. Tiwanaku at 4 o'clock in the morning is an extremely cold place, but a wonderful place to visit. And here's the thing. The alignment to the summer solstice sunrise is not perfect in our time today, but it was perfect 12,000 years ago, because as well as the motion of the Earth that I've already told you about, there's also a change in the tilt of the axis of the Earth, and that would have aligned the summer solstice sunrise perfectly with the orientation of the Kalasasea in 10,000 BC, 12,000 years ago. Go back to Göbekli Tepe. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe have this curious letter H on them, just like the letter H that we see at Tiwanaku. And something else, all of the pillars at Göbekli Tepe are anthropomorphic, they're humanoid in form. The T shape at the top is the head of the figure, and the figures have arms, crooked at the elbow, and they have fingers that cross over the belly in front of above a belt. Oddly enough, on the other side of the world, the Easter Island Moai have the same hand position and the same suggestion of a belt. Now, these Easter Island Moai are only supposed to be 700 years old, maybe 1,000 years old at the most. How do archaeologists know the age of the Easter Island figures? We know they can't date the stone directly. What they date is the platform on which the statues stand, and these platforms are called ahu. And what they're looking for is bits of organic material that are between the stones of the platform, and then they make the deduction that the statues are the same age as the platform and as the organic material found in the platform. But there's obvious problems with that immediately, because when you go around to the back of that platform, you find that an ancient Easter Island head has actually been used in the construction of the platform. And that tells us that the Easter Island figures must be older than the platform itself. Is it possible that a later culture came to Easter Island, found these very ancient statues, and erected them on platforms, giving us a falsely young date for the statues themselves? For example, there are some parts of Easter Island where the statues are still buried. This is the Rano Raraku crater. Very eerie and mysterious place, I have to say. Hundreds of Easter Island heads here. And you might imagine, looking at them, that they just go down a meter or so under the ground. But in fact, Thor Heyerdahl, who excavated this site in the 1980s, proved otherwise. These statues actually go down 10 meters underground. 10 meters of sediment have built up since the statue was created. And you have to ask yourself, how long would it take on a tiny island like Easter Island for 10 meters of sediment to build up around these statues? Certainly not 700 or 1,000 years, more like 10,000 or 12,000 years. I had the privilege of knowing Thor Heyerdahl. He was a great man. He was a big believer in Atlantis, and I think he would have been absolutely intrigued by possible connections between Göbekli Tepe and Easter Island. The Great Sphinx of Giza is another question mark over the story of history. I won't go into it in great depth because the matter has already been explored in detail, but my colleagues John Anthony West, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year, and Professor Robert Schoch of Boston University have looked at the erosion patterns on the Sphinx, and they have concluded that at some point during its life, the Great Sphinx was exposed to about 1,000 years of extremely heavy rainfall. And such rains never fell in Egypt in the time of the pharaohs. You have to go back to the end of the last ice age, to the Younger Dryas, about 12,000 years ago, to get that heavy rainfall in the Sahara Desert that could have caused the erosion patterns that we see on the Sphinx. And it's interesting that ancient maps document this. Here's the Canepa map from 1489, and it is based on a much older source map that's now lost. And look, there's a clearly marked river channel and the indication of a green and fertile Sahara in the Canepa map. And this river channel has recently been revealed as a result of remote sensing. A radar survey of Mauritania revealed a river channel in exactly the place that is shown on this ancient map. Was somebody mapping the world during the last ice age and did copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of those original source maps survive into almost modern times? This is the famous Piri Reis map of 1513, and it shows North America, the east coast of South America, and it's suggested that it shows Antarctica down here. I won't go into the Antarctica issue in great depth, but a couple of things to mention. Piri Reis tells us in his own handwriting on this fragment of a map, West Africa, the eastern part of South America. It was once a world map. This is all that's left of it. But fortunately, some of Piri Reis's own handwriting survives, and he tells us that he based the map on more than 100 older maps, and that his purpose was to preserve the information on those more ancient maps. And he in fact says that some of those maps had come from the Library of Alexandria. None of the source maps have survived. Piri Reis's map has survived. Look at this island, which is roughly off the coast of Florida in North America. And I've enlarged it here, and running up the middle of the island is a row of very distinctive looking megaliths. This island stands in exactly the place of the Grand Bahama Banks. And when you go diving there off the island of Bimini, you find megaliths of the kind that are depicted on this map, except those megaliths are now underwater. It suggests that somebody was mapping this area when sea level was much lower during the last ice age. The same is true in other parts of the world. This little island shown off the coast of the island of Ireland, this little island doesn't exist today, but it did exist 12,000 years ago when sea levels were much lower. And Antarctica, of course, our civilization discovered Antarctica in the year 1818. Before that, we didn't know that Antarctica exists. Well, we know it exists today. But in the early 1800s, if you were an honest map maker, you just left a hole where Antarctica is. This is a Russian map from the early 1800s, and because they didn't know Antarctica was there, they left it blank. There's just nothing there. But the weird thing is, if you go back before the 1800s, go back to the 1600s, the 1500s, and look at maps that again are based on older source maps, you find that Antarctica is everywhere. It's in the right place. It's a bit larger than it is today, but then it was larger during the Ice Age. So, and there are multiple examples of this. So all in all, I would say that the case is mounting. The case is mounting that there has been a major forgotten episode in human history, that archaeology has been too rigid, too fixed in its ways, too unwilling to consider extraordinary ideas. And that if we're going to get to grips with our past, we have to break the stranglehold of archaeology and open our minds to other possibilities, particularly so, since we now know that a giant global cataclysm unfolded between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. And that global cataclysm, which has not been taken into account by archaeologists, I would say completely destabilizes the foundations of the house of history. And that we are required, just as you do not build a house on foundations of sand, you do not build your house of history on illusory foundations that don't take account of the most recent and most important evidence. It's not entirely the fault of archaeologists. It's very recent information, but it's time they contemplated the possibility that everything we've been taught about the origins of civilization could be wrong. And then we must ask, what about the future of civilization? Because NASA's reassuring figure of 100 million year intervals between extinction level events is, in my view, complacent and irresponsible. NASA can only tell us about the objects that it has already seen. And it's pretty sure that the objects it has already seen are not going to hit the Earth within the next 100 years. The problem is the objects they haven't seen. And new objects are being identified every day. In fact, it's estimated that only 1% of potentially hazardous asteroids have been identified, and that 99% of them, more than 100,000, still await discovery. And it's almost every day now that we get a wake-up call from the universe, where a new asteroid or comet fragment sweeps by that nobody's ever seen before, and it passes between the Earth and the Moon, and we only see it after it's gone. This is why scientists are becoming more and more concerned that we are making a mistake, that we don't live in a safe era, that we potentially live in a very dangerous era. And the gravest danger of all is posed by the Taurid meteor stream. And those two periods of danger, in June and in November, when we spend 12.5 days passing through the Taurid meteor stream. And that Taurid meteor stream, like a great highway, has many different lanes of traffic inside it. And some of those lanes contain very small objects, and some of those lanes contain very large objects. And what I compare it to is putting on a blindfold and crossing an 8-lane highway twice a year and just hoping that you don't meet any traffic. Or if you do, that it might be a motorcycle rather than a truck. As a matter of fact, the scientists working on this believe that the Taurid meteor stream is the greatest collision hazard facing the Earth at the present time. And their calculations indicate that there are probably 200 very large objects within it, and that one of them may be as much as 30 kilometers in diameter. I'm not saying this to spread gloom and doom. We have a choice. We have the technology now to mine asteroids. People are talking about mining asteroids because there's a financial return in it. And we have the technology now to divert asteroids and comets. If they are in a dangerous orbit, they don't need to hit the Earth. We can move them. But it would require a giant effort of humankind. For the first time, humanity would have to stop fighting stupid little wars with each other and would have to join together to protect the future of our children and our grandchildren and the whole human race to come. And unfortunately, we seem incapable of making that decision. We can spend trillions of dollars on weapons of mass destruction, but we're unwilling to spend a single cent on protecting the Earth and protecting the future of humanity. Now let's suppose that it were to happen again. Let's suppose, as is suggested, that within the next 30 or 40 years, we cross one of those filaments of the Taurid meteor stream that is full of large objects, and we face an event rather like the Younger Dryas cataclysm of 12,800 years ago. What would happen? Who would survive? These days, when you live in a modern city, you're hardly even aware of the sky and of the stars. There's so much light pollution from cities that you can't really see the stars. But if you get outside the Earth in a NASA satellite and look down on the Earth, parts of the Earth light up like a string of jewels. There's Europe, Italy. There's beautiful, brightly lit Europe. Why? Because Europe is technologically advanced. And as a matter of fact, these images are often taken to speak to the technological advancement of certain parts of the world and the relative lack of advancement in others. Most of Africa is not electrified, and that's why Africa is dark at night. And if we go to the other hemisphere, to North America, we can see that North America is glowing with light at night, but the Amazon jungle is dark because there's very little electricity in the Amazon jungle. But if we were to face another cataclysm, like the cataclysm that struck the Earth 12,800 years ago, I do not think it would be people living in the technological north who survived. We do not have survival skills in the technological north. We depend entirely on our technology and on the intricate, closely connected network of skills. If you have a cataclysm, it's going to blow that network apart. And suddenly the powerful, rich, wealthy North is going to find itself completely helpless. And I believe that civilization would collapse very, very, very fast. Who would survive, hardly touched, would be the hunter-gatherers in places like the Amazon. Because the hunter-gatherers, what are they? They're people who are in the business of survival. They know how to survive. They would get through the cataclysm, and those of us from the rich, technological, industrialized North would not get through the cataclysm. And let's imagine now, 12,000 years in the future, the descendants of those hunter-gatherers who survived are telling a myth. They tell of a time, thousands of years ago in the past, when there was once a great civilization on Earth. It was so powerful, they could actually send men to the moon. They could fly around the planet. They could speak to one another and see one another on the other side of the Earth. Their powers were so great that they were almost like gods. But sadly, corruption entered in. They became cruel. They began to impose their power around the world and to enforce their will upon other people. They became proud and arrogant. They ceased to wear their prosperity with humility, and the universe slapped them down. So I would say in closing, the choice is ours. Let's make sure we're not the next lost civilization. Thank you. Thank you.